Hello, and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Summer 2021. The summer of the staycation, or what people just used to call holidays, before we all took going abroad for granted.
Maybe you've managed to organise a trip somewhere. Or maybe you're just staying at home and enjoying the warmer weather and longer days.
Or maybe you're in the southern hemisphere and snuggling up by the fireside for some cosy winter reading.
Either way, we've each got a stack of books we think will make the perfect companions for these summer months. In mine, I've got Hotel Silence by Oder Avith Olafsdottir, The Book of Hidden Things by Francesco Dimitri, D, A Tale of Two Worlds by Michael Faber, and Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese.
And in mine, I've got Sorrow Bliss by Meg Mason, Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden-Keefe, Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri, The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dalila Harris, and Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead.
Keep listening to find out why you should add these books to your suitcase or side table this summer holiday.
Laura, have you actually got any kind of summer holiday planned?
I do. I'm going on holiday or vacation, as some Canadians say, in 10 days. And not only am I going on holiday, I am going to be joined by all of my family members. So my family, my parents, my brother's family, and my sister's family. And it's a huge family reunion. I haven't seen my brother in 3 years. I haven't seen my sister in a year. So it's a big deal. I don't know how much reading I'm going to get in.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just going to ask. Well,
it's a concern.
But I feel like your family know you well enough to know that you're going to need to just take yourself off sometimes and be alone and silent with a book.
I think my husband will just be like, go. Go and hide. You need to take a break. Go forth and read. So fingers crossed. What about you?
Yeah, I also have a family holiday. I'm off to the east coast of England for 3 weeks, where we actually go every year. So this is not in any way exceptional for me. If the summer so far has been anything to go by, then I'm not expecting that we will be lolling around on sun-drenched beaches. But you know, Laura, as a child, I endured summer after summer of picnics in damp cars, eating sandwiches while the rain smashed down on the windscreen outside. And I feel this is a rite of passage that my children and my husband need to go through.
I think that's fair. And hey, any continuity with the weather I grew up with is weirdly comforting nowadays.
Yes, same. I agree. Well, let's get on to the books. Actually, interesting you mentioned families, because my first one, Sorrow Bliss, is primarily a family story. It tells the story of Martha Friel. And when we meet her, you're plunged straight into her life at the beginning, and you can see that it is absolutely falling apart. It's her 40th birthday. She's basically miserable and mean to everyone, including her husband, at this sweet birthday party that he's organised for her. And then subsequently, he actually leaves. He just walks out, and it's clear that he's had enough. And then the novel switches back and forth between present-day Martha and her childhood into early adulthood, and you meet the rest of her family. Her father, who is a poet, but not a very functional one. He sort of wrote a lot, but didn't really publish anything. Her mother was a sculptress, completely wound up in her work and in almost performing this role of being an eccentric, creative type who didn't have much time to devote to her family and her children. And then Martha's sister, Ingrid, who is her soulmate and who she absolutely loves. And there is this incredible bond between them and this very funny, sparky relationship that's just beautifully observed. It's so well done. You're kind of wondering all the time, like, why is Martha the way that she is? And she has this event in her early teens where she suffers what is diagnosed at the time as glandular fever, but it's just this kind of collapse of her ability to do things normally. And then we see her as she struggles on through life. She has diagnosis after diagnosis. She's prescribed every kind of antidepressant. She takes them, but nothing really changes anything. And yeah, you're just almost like her in a way, like the main character. You're consumed by this curiosity to find out, well, what is wrong? What's going on here? And then she does finally have a diagnosis, a doctor who is able to identify something that has always been overlooked. And when she hears it, the symptoms so perfectly match what she has experienced her entire life. She knows that that is the true thing that's going on. And interestingly, the author doesn't actually name it, which I think some people might find exasperating. I didn't, but when I've been reading reactions to this book, I know that that's something that some people struggle with. I think it was a really interesting choice not to actually name it, because it almost broadens out the discussion of mental illness and its effects on the people around the person who's experiencing something like this, their family, their partners, their children, which I think is what Meg Mason's really interested in. And if you're curious to hear what this sounds like, very excitingly, I have a clip. The audiobook is narrated by Amelia Fox, and I'm reproducing it with the kind permission of the Orion Publishing Group.
My sister and I still look alike. Our jaws are similarly too square, but according to our mother, we somehow get away with it. Our hair has the same tendency towards straggliness, has generally always been long, and was the same blondish colour until I turned 39 and realised in the morning that I could not stop 40 from coming. In the afternoon, I got it cut to 2 square jaw length, then went home and bleached it with supermarket dye. Ingrid came over while I was doing it and used the rest. Both of us struggled with its upkeep. Ingrid said it would have been less work just to have another baby. I have known since I was young that, although we are so similar, people think Ingrid is more beautiful than I am. I told my father once. He said, "They might look at her first, but they'll want to look at you for longer."
It sounds like a worthy read. What is it that makes it a good summer read? You're going to have to persuade me.
It's so funny. It's laugh out loud funny. And you know me, nothing makes me laugh. And this is hilarious. It is so well observed. And every line has something in it. It's incredibly rich. I thought the family dynamics are so beautifully observed. The drama and tension is just so perfectly calibrated to keep you turning the pages. And I was up till the small hours of the morning reading this one. And just every once in a while, it will make you laugh out loud, particularly this relationship between Martha and her sister. One of the things I really loved about this was that at the end, the author includes a note in which she explicitly states that it is a work of fiction and it's not something that she herself has experienced. And it feels so true that when you read that, I almost felt a bit surprised because it felt to me like it was coming from someone's lived experience. And when I finished it and I saw that note, I just thought, wow, what a work of fiction. You know, there's so much, we read a lot of it. There's a lot of autofiction, people fictionalizing their own stories or weaving their own stories in with fictional elements. And what I loved about this is that it's a novel. It's invented. She wanted to explore these ideas and these themes, and she created these characters, and she really thought about this scenario, and she made it believable and funny and true. It took my breath away. I thought it was so, so good.
Interesting. I didn't anticipate you saying it was funny. That is a persuasive hook to kind of undercut what sounds otherwise like quite a serious read.
You know, the one other thing I say is the publishers, you know, on the blurb, there's lots of comparisons. People are comparing it to Fleabag and Ottessa Moshfegh, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, Rachel Cusk, Joan Didion, Sally Rooney, Marianne Keyes. I was sort of reading all of these and I was just surprised because when I was reading it, I wasn't thinking about anyone else. The writing is so assured and distinctive. And I think it's one of those books you have a bit of a book hangover after you finish it. You're not quite ready to dive into anything else, and it's because I missed that voice. But you know, it's Meg Mason's voice. Meg Mason is the new Meg Mason. You know, it's as simple as that.
Fair enough. Well, Hotel Silence by Uder Ava Olafsdottir is a perfect companion novel in many ways because it is very funny. It's by an author with a very distinctive voice, translated here by Brian Fitzgibbon because Olafsdottir writes in Icelandic. And it is the story of a very unhappy man in his 40s who is contemplating suicide. But the practicalities of committing suicide keep getting in the way, in that he's very concerned that his young adult daughter, she's in her early 20s, is going to find him. And he doesn't want to be an inconvenience. He wants to take his own life, but he doesn't want anyone to be put out. And so he hatches this plan that he's going to travel to a country that has recently been ravaged by war. There's a peace agreement now in place. And the country's never stated and the timings are a bit obscure. I kept thinking maybe the Balkans. I mean, in theory, it could be Syria, but I think it is really meant to be quite vague. And he arrives there. He brings his toolkit, practical man, because he's planning on hanging himself from the ceiling. This all sounds, again, quite bleak.
Summer reading.
But the brother and sister who are trying to rebuild this hotel, he's the second visitor. And they see his toolkit, and they're like, what's he here to do? And despite himself, he just begins to repair the hotel. And as you might expect, perhaps, begin to repair himself and to make new human connections. And I think Ólafsdóttir is very interested in showing the despair that can hit men, and I think isn't examined very often, even though men, and especially men of a certain age, commit suicide in much higher numbers than women. It's a delightful read. It sounds bleak, it sounds strange, and it isn't either of those things. It's just really heartwarming. I think with summer reading, you can go either way. You either want a big chunky book, or you want a smaller slip of a novel so that you can gain pace and work through your pile. In this case, Hotel Silence is maybe like 250 pages, and I found it super delightful.
And you loved Miss Iceland by her, didn't you? It's lovely when you discover an author and then you get to read other books by them.
Yeah, this is the second book I read in quick succession, and I do plan on picking up the third novel that's translated into English at the library sometime soon.
Well, if we're talking slim novels, then I feel I should come on to Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri, which I read a while ago, but which has lingered with me, not so much the plot and the events, which have faded, but what I remember very clearly was the feeling I had when I read it, because I just loved it so much. I was stealing away from my family so that I could have an excuse to curl up and read a few more pages. I couldn't quite work out what it was I loved about it so much, because on the face of it, there's not a lot going on. It's a woman living alone in an unnamed Italian city. I think Jhumpa Lahiri lives in Rome. Here the city's never named. And in short chapters, we follow this woman on her journeys around the city, whether she's going to where she works or going to cafes for lunch or she's meeting friends. And we get to share her observations and her thoughts. And occasionally she goes to visit her mother, with whom we learn she has quite a difficult relationship, so there's a little bit of detail about her family background, and you get the sense that she had quite an unhappy childhood. And gradually you get very drawn into this person and who she is. This is another one where, thanks to Bloomsbury Publishing, I have a clip. This one is narrated by Susan Vinciotti Bonito.
In the mornings after breakfast, I walk past a small marble plaque propped against the high wall flanking the road. I never knew the man who died, but over the years I've come to know his name, his surname. I know the month and day he was born, and the month and day his life ended. This was a man who died 2 days after his birthday, in February. It must have been an accident on his bike, or his motorcycle, or maybe he was walking at night, distracted. Maybe he was hit by a passing car. He was 44 when it happened. I suppose he died in this very spot, on the sidewalk next to the wall that sprouts neglected plants, which is why the plaque has been arranged at the bottom, at the feet of passers-by. The road is full of curves and snakes uphill. It's a bit dangerous. The sidewalk is vexing, crowded with exposed tree roots. Some sections are nearly impossible to negotiate because of the roots. That's why I, too, tend to walk on the road. There's usually a candle burning in a container of red glass, along with a small bunch of flowers and the statue of a saint. There's no photograph of him. Above the candle, attached to the wall, there's a note from his mother, written by hand, encased in a milky plastic sleeve. It greets those who stop for a moment to ponder the death of her son. I would like to personally thank those who dedicate a few minutes of their time to my son's memory. But if that's not possible, I thank you anyway, from the bottom of my heart, it says. I've never seen the mother or any other person in front of the plaque. Thinking of the mother just as much as the son, I keep walking, feeling slightly less alive.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. Why am I recommending this for summer reading?
These all seem very serious and literary.
Well, and it's true that audio quote, to my ears, it sounded very downbeat. I think what it is that it's trying to capture, there's a kind of stillness and a precision to the writing here that I think as you got used to the audiobook, or much as you do when you're sinking into reading the words on the page, you get into the rhythm of it and it just unfolds so beautifully. It's a book where the pleasure for me was in this beautiful language, and she wrote it in Italian and then translated it into English. And so there's something there about every word has been weighed and considered, and you really sense that as you're reading it. And also, this is a woman who doesn't have any ties. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have children. She has a mother, but the mother isn't dependent on her. I think Lahiri is considering this as a state of being and holding this up. And there's something really exhilarating about it, especially if you're someone like me who has a lot of ties. And I very rarely get to experience that sense of freedom of just thinking, where shall I eat lunch? Maybe I'll go and stay with friends without even having to discuss it with a partner or anyone. There's something really exhilarating about that I really loved. It's a quiet little book. But for me, it was a really powerful read that I absolutely loved.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to chuck in my first unnamed book. It's inevitable, isn't it, that we're just going to throw in some other summer reads that weren't on the list.
I want to hear all the extras.
Well, the extra is Second Place by Rachel Cusk.
Oh, have you read that?
Well, I'm in the last 30 or so pages. It's the first Rachel Cusk novel I've read, and actually my book club's reading it.
Great, so I'll get to read it too.
Yes, and we can discuss it in more detail. I mention it because it has similar themes, I think, about a woman's place in the world and how that place evolves as she ages. And it has this very compelling and quite, I'm not sure, I can't decide if she's irritating narrator. But it's just this really powerful depiction of point of view. I don't know quite how to describe it. It's not like anything I've ever read. It does reinforce my perception that Rachel Cusk is kind of a New Yorker writer. There's quite a lot of sentences where I finish them and think, what? What? What's she trying to say? What philosophical point is there? And yet it also builds into this really suspenseful place, and I'm very curious to see how it ends. And it's not too long either. Yeah, I think that would be a really good summer read too. The books that I'm supposed to be telling you about are so different.
I feel like this show could have gone in any direction, because the book that I've been reading that I just can't put down or stop talking about is called The Splendid and the Vile, which is a history of the Second World War. And I mean, it's like beach reading, but it's so good.
And of course, beach reading means something different to everyone.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I think we should do Great Circle last.
Yes, well, I had placed it last.
Oh, wonderful. Well, because I have it on my stack of summer reading books. It's coming up for me, and I think it's on a lot of people's radar for this summer. So listeners, we will get to a book that, might actually fit the distinctive label of summer reading.
What have you got next on your planned stack?
D, A Tale of Two Worlds by Michael Faber. It's a wonderful children's story, really. I mean, it's not YA, not at all. It's really in the tradition of C.S. Lewis and Narnia. It starts off one morning in a seaside town in the south of England when Dalila, who is our heroine, notices that D has disappeared from how people speak. And soon after, she notices that D has disappeared from all writing full stop. This might not seem too problematic, but actually very quickly anything that used the word D disappears. So like dogs begin to vanish. She doesn't know where they've gone to, but because D is no longer available, so too dogs have slightly disappeared from view. And an old teacher in an old house seems to have the key, the understanding to what's going on. And so when she connects with him, she is basically taken to a portal to another world, of course, right? This is the tradition. She enters the world of Liminus, which is ruled by the dictator Gamp, and she proceeds to have a series of adventures, very episodic, very chapter by chapter. She has to overcome an obstacle. She has to get away from some cannibalistic trolls, or she has to escape this mansion that has locked her inside. And all the while, she is accompanied by a Sphinx, who this old teacher has, I was going to say put under her care, but actually it's the reverse. The Sphinx is looking after Dalila, and she's quite a intimidating magical companion. It's beautifully written. Have you ever read Michael Faber?
No. People have recommended him to me before. The Crimson Petal and the White, is it? It's
exactly.
Supposed to be really good.
Yeah. So
but they're quite long, his books, which has always put me off.
Well, this isn't too long because it is really aimed at children. And on that, it might be a wonderful book for you to read to your kids. I think they're probably around the age where it might work well for them. He's such an accomplished writer. And I picked it up because I knew his name. I also love a good fantasy. And Neil Gaiman had endorsed it as a magical read. And it is so well done and heartwarming and simple. And you know what? That's sometimes what I want when I'm hanging out at the beach. Nothing too demanding.
We have a clip of this one as well, kindly provided by Penguin Audiobooks. This one is narrated by Isabel Adamako-Young.
The first ray of light each morning always made her feel the sun was in the wrong place, or she was in the wrong place, or both. She would wake in her big, soft bed, under a duvet decorated with smiling blonde princesses, and the cold English light would already be busy filling up the room, looking weird. She told her friend Mariette about this, and Mariette said, "It must be because you're missing the light back home." "Home?" said Diccolo. "Where you're from?" "I suppose so," said Diccolo. But she didn't suppose so, really. She had no memories of where she was from, and she'd never been back there. It didn't even exist. Mariette, Diccolo's best friend, came from France. Diccolo hadn't been there either, but it existed for sure. People went there all the time. It was just across the channel. On clear days, peering out over the cliffs at Corba, she could even see it. It was a subtle haze between the silvery grey of the water and the blue of the sky.
I had never heard of that. It sounds so intriguing.
I picked it up in the 7-day reading category at the library, where like brand new releases, you've got 7 days to get through them. It basically puts pressure on you that first day to decide if you enjoy it enough to read it quickly. And I think if you don't, you're like, I'll just return it. But if you do enjoy it, you're like, great, okay, let's keep going.
Well, there's no connection really, but can I just come on to my next light-hearted summer read, which is a book about the opioid crisis in America. This is by Patrick Radden-Keefe, who is not a new author to me because your book club, Laura, did Say Nothing, his book about the IRA, which I read and loved, but we never got to discuss it because sometimes we just get a bit behind, don't we? And we didn't have time to podcast on it. So it was one that I loved, but I never really got to talk about. But I was really keen to read his new one. So this is non-fiction, and it tells the story of the Sackler family. The Sackler name you might know is synonymous with art and culture mainly. For generations, this family have been patrons of major art and educational institutions. And here, Radden-Keefe is telling the story of the product that lay behind their extraordinary wealth, which is this slow-release opium-based drug, OxyContin. I love non-fiction, but I love it even more when it reads like the best, most compulsive page-turning thriller, which this absolutely does. It is a long book. There is a lot of detail, but it's never boring. He takes us back into the family's history, and we learn about Arthur Sackler, the family patriarch, and his two brothers, who were the ones who founded the pharmaceutical business. And looking into their upbringing and their stories, we start to understand the reasons why they very much preferred to stay in the background, and also the reasons why they were so obsessed with putting their names on things, on pediments and things, why that was important to them. And we learn about Arthur's genius for advertising and promotion, and then how he went on to use those techniques to sell this pharmaceutical product to doctors all over America, and how, most crucially of all, the Sacklers and the senior management at this company were fully aware that the drug that they had developed was highly addictive, dangerously so, and yet they continued to sell it anyway. If you've ever seen Succession, the Sky series, which my husband and I, we watched virtually nothing, but we watched that and we loved it so much. And this definitely has a flavour of that, where the second generation of Sacklers come along, and then the third, and they're all just unbelievably wealthy, and they just want more and more and more money. It's so good. This is a long book. I finished it and I basically wanted to turn back to the front and start again. I enjoyed it that much.
He is a great writer. Say Nothing was excellent. So I think this could get added to my pile. And if not my reading pile, I think my dad might like it for his summer reading.
And I wonder, it's a tricky one with audio because it's very much a book where there's lots of endnotes. And in fact, it's one of those books where I read the endnotes with as much interest as I read the main text. And I'm not sure how it would work on audio if you couldn't see those. But he reads it, which would be the good thing about the audio, I reckon, having him tell you this story. Because afterwards, you just want to talk to him about it and say, it's unbelievable that you found this. And oh my God, all of these WhatsApp chats, the material, the amount of material he must have had to comb through in order to pull out these absolutely dynamite, riveting little nuggets that tell the story and so clearly point the finger at who knew what and what they did to conceal what they knew. I mean, it's just so fascinating. And this is a story where the repercussions are ongoing. I mean, this is not a story that has ended by any means. These drugs continue to be sold. Addiction continues to be an enormous problem. It's just fascinating. I loved it. I suppose one of the things about holiday is I love things that really take me out of myself and take me on a journey and carry me away a little bit. And this, in fact, all of the books I'm recommending today actually did that for me.
Yeah, and that doesn't have to mean it's light, breezy reading, which is a good segue to my next book, which is Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese.
I have never heard of this author.
Well, he is an Ojibwe author. He's actually passed on. This book was written in 2012. He's from the Wabeseemoong First Nation in northwestern Ontario. I did not think that this was a book I wanted to read this summer, although it was a book I definitely felt I should read because, as many listeners will be aware, there is much work to be done around reconciliation with the First Nations of Canada, and that is an ongoing process that all Canadians need to be involved in, really, kind of in facing the atrocities of our history and our government and our people. Recently, it's been in the headlines, the number of unmarked graves that have been found outside residential schools in Kamloops, which is in my home province, but in 2 other schools in Canada. Now, keep in mind that there were hundreds of these schools. And these schools, I mean, having read this book, calling them schools is deceptive. In my mind, they were basically concentration camps for children. There were no gas chambers, but first the Catholic Church and then the Canadian government were so neglectful and violent and abusive, both sexually and physically, that these children as young as 5 died in terrible, terrible circumstances, in terrible isolation, and it should never have happened. You grow up knowing a little bit about it, but obviously the horror of it is still coming out in an ongoing process. Indian Horse is the story of a young boy who, despite his family's best efforts to stay hidden living a traditional life in northwestern Ontario in the 1960s, he is eventually put into a residential school where he experiences and also sees abuse all around him. Now, this could be an incredibly bleak book, and in some ways it is, but our character, so his name is Saul Indian Horse, is an incredible ice hockey player. And I think everyone will also know that ice hockey is a Canadian obsession. Through ice hockey, Saul is really able to chart a path through these horrors towards something better. But of course, it's not that straightforward. It sounds like a grueling read. It's not. It's so beautifully written. The language is so crisp and it's so worthwhile. It's so vital, really, I think. It's good that this novel is actually taught to a lot of grade 12 students. So that's the final year of high school now. I finished reading it and was just like, yes. And then I went to the Truth and Reconciliation report. That was the result of a very long consultation process with Indigenous communities and with residential school survivors. And so having read the fictional story, I went back and was reading through the testimonies of the survivors of these schools. It's very important that Canadians read it, but it's also a very valuable and incredibly good novel. So if you are looking for something that pushes you, I think this is the one to do it. I'd highly recommend it.
I wasn't sure if it would be available here in the UK, but I looked it up and it is available. I'd be interested to learn, Laura, that it was shortlisted for the International Impact Dublin Literary Award.
I don't understand why it wasn't nominated for other awards. Maybe it wasn't entered into them. That can happen, right? It was a small Canadian publisher. Maybe they just didn't enter it into the big international awards.
But that's why I love that prize, because, you know, it finds the good stuff from around the world. It's such a good prize. Okay, back to our list. The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dalila Harris. This is a recent read. I just finished it the other day. 26-year-old editorial assistant Nella Rogers is tired of being the only black employee at Wagner Books. Fed up with the isolation and the microaggressions, she's thrilled when Hazel starts working in the cubicle beside hers. They've only just started comparing natural hair care regimens when a string of uncomfortable events causes Nella to become public enemy number 1 and Hazel the office darling. Then the notes begin to appear on Nella's desk. Leave Wagner now. It's hard to believe that Hazel is behind these hostile messages, but as Nella starts to spiral and obsess over the sinister forces at play, she soon realises there's a lot more at stake than her career.
I have read about this book and think it sounds so intriguing.
Yeah, this is another one where, thanks to Bloomsbury Publishing, I have a clip. And this is one of those books that's narrated by more than one person. It's narrated by Aya Naomi King, Janice Abbott Pratt, Barney Turpin, and Heather Alice Sims.
The first sign was the smell of cocoa butter. When it initially crept around the wall of her cubicle, Nella was too busy filing a stack of pages at her desk, aligning each and every one so that the manuscript was perfectly flush. She was so intent on completing this task, Vera Perini needed everything to be flush, always, that she had the nerve to ignore the smell. Only when it inched up her nostrils and latched onto a deep part of her brain did she stop what she was doing and lift her head with sudden interest. It wasn't the scent alone that gave her pause. Nella Rogers was used to all kinds of uninvited smells creeping into her cubicle, usually terrible ones. Since she was merely an editorial assistant at Wagner Books, she had no private office and therefore no walls or windows. She and the other open space assistants were at the mercy of a hard-boiled egg or the passing of gas. They were often left to suffer the consequences for what felt like an hour afterward. Adjusting to such close proximity had been so difficult for Nella during her first few weeks at Wagner that she'd practiced breathing through her mouth even when it wasn't called for, like when she was deciding between granolas at the grocery store or when she was having sex with her boyfriend Owen. After about 3 months of failed self-training, she had broken down and purchased a lavender reed diffuser that had the words, "Just breathe," scrawled across its front in gold cursive letters. Its home was the far corner of her desk, where it sat just beneath the first edition of Kindred that Owen had given her shortly after they started dating. Nella eyed the gold foil letters and frowned. Could it have been the lavender diffuser she smelled? She inhaled again, craning her neck upward so that all she could see were the gray and white tiles that lined the ceiling. No, she'd been correct. That was cocoa butter, all right. And it wasn't just any cocoa butter. It was brown butter, her favorite brand of hair grease. Nella looked around. Once she was sure the coast was clear, she stuck her hand into her thick black hair and pulled a piece of it as close to her nose as she could. She'd been proudly growing an afro over the last 3 years, but the strand still landed unsatisfyingly between her nose and her cheek. Nonetheless, it fell close enough to tell her that the brown butter smell wasn't coming from her own hair. What she was smelling was fresh, a coat applied within the last hour or so, she guessed. This meant one of 2 things. One of her white colleagues had started using brown butter, or, more likely, since she was pretty sure none of them had accidentally stumbled into the natural hair care aisle, there was another black girl on the 13th floor.
Is this one a page-turner?
It's such a page-turner. On the one level, it's, I think, very intentionally a pacey conspiracy thriller. Nella is the one that you're rooting for. You don't know what's happening to her. She doesn't know. She's trying to figure it out. Is Hazel her friend or her enemy? And it's wonderfully tense. And at the same time, it's very interesting in the nuances, I suppose, in the way that she's considering identity, black identity, even in the most obvious protagonists, Hazel and Nella. Nella, I think, Dalila Harris has talked about how she shares many of her own experiences. You know, she grew up in Connecticut in a community that was mostly white. Many of her closest childhood friends were white. And so for her, it was only really when she moved to New York and she was living in Brooklyn that she started to find a closer black community for herself. Whereas Hazel is someone who's grown up in Harlem. She is deeply connected and embedded in this very strong black community and has these amazing dreadlocks and runs a poetry workshop group for aspiring young black female writers. And so when Nella encounters Hazel, she wants to befriend her, and yet she recognizes that they're not the same and that there is actually a real gulf between them. And I mean, that's just one example. This novel is full of really subtle, interesting points about difference, I suppose, and the ways that that can matter and how that can shape people and the way that people act. And of course, this publisher's is classic publishing, entirely white, except for Nella. And she's working on books where she has issues to do with certain characters and the way they're represented, and she feels maybe she needs to voice them, but she can't because no one wants to hear those critical thoughts. And she's only an editorial assistant. She is someone who wants to get ahead and wants to succeed in this publishing world. So it's about how far does this character compromise what she really thinks and what she believes in pursuit of the longer goal of succeeding in this white-run environment and, you know, fitting herself carefully into these boxes so as not to disturb anyone or upset anyone. I mean, it was such an interesting book. It's a first novel, and it felt a little bit uneven to me. There's a character, you don't only hear it from Nella's point of view, there is another character whose story is also told, and it jumps between them. And for me, that didn't really work very well. I found this other character, you don't find out who it is for quite a long time when the plot all dovetails together. But until that happens, I found it a bit disruptive because it kept jolting me out of the narrative. I was just like, who is this person? I don't understand who this voice is or where they're coming from. So it was a little bit uneven in that way, but I also thought just brilliant for book club because there's just so much there. It's such a great, fun, interesting read with characters you really care about and root for, and just a good, zinging plot, but also lots of things to unpick and discuss. And yeah, I just think it'd be a great one. So great summer read and a great book club read.
I think we're heating up on the summer reading now. That leads nicely into my totally trashy escapist recommendation.
Ooh, what you got?
Well, I just discovered it on the library bookshelves, and it's called The Book of Hidden Things by Francesco Dimitri. He is a very successful Italian fantasy writer who lives in the UK, and this is the first book that he has written in English. He's a fantasy writer. I don't know that this is a fantasy book. People will have to read it and decide for themselves. But it tells the story of 4 friends who grew up in a small town, quite mafia-run, in Puglia, in the south of Italy. And once a year, they all show up on the day that they agreed in their final year of high school, and they reunite and they have pizza and they catch up. It can be just like a 24-hour thing. And so our main protagonist arrives, and he's not sure that the other guys are going to show. He himself didn't show the previous year, and he really hates going back to Puglia. He's estranged from his father, and they all think he's got this great career as a photographer in London, and actually he's just getting by. He shows up, 2 of his other friends show up, but Art, who's this kind of, not a lost soul, but just a real character, doesn't appear. And he appears to have vanished. And in fact, when they were 13 and all out one night in the depths of barren Puglia, Art left them and walked up to this grove, and he disappeared for a week. And there was this huge hoopla in the national media about this child being kidnapped, and everyone suspected the worst. And Art returned a week later in the same clothes, untouched, perfectly clean, and he told everyone that he had just run away. But his friends knew that was a lie. He knew that his friends knew it was a lie. And so there was just this strange blip in their teenage years. And now Art has gone missing again. You then have rapid fire events kicking off over the next 48 hours. There's a gratuitous sex scene in the water, and you're like, why is that there? And then there's mafia, and there's jumping over fires, and there's kind of like light violence and mystery. I read this on my first summer vacation, and I was like, this is great. I'm having such a good time. And so if it sounds appealing, just dive in. It's not unproblematic, but sometimes you just want to read a book for the moment and then forget about it afterwards.
Another author I've never heard of, but that does sound great.
And of course, it's set in Puglia in this baking heat. And there's something I think about reading about hot weather in the hot weather that just adds an extra something to a book being a good fit with holiday reads.
I didn't say before, but one of the main attractions of Whereabouts, of course, is that it's set in Italy. You feel like you're walking around these ancient Italian towns in the sunshine with her, eating this fabulous food for lunch and then having your little espresso before you go back to your apartment for a siesta. And if I can't go to these places, at least I can read about them.
Great Circle. It's sitting right in front of me. I have a beautiful edition. I don't know if it's the same as yours.
Oh, very nice. Well, I'm reading it on Kindle, but I'm about halfway through. This is a long read. It's about 600 pages. But once you're in, I think.
An unforgettable, mesmerizing new novel from one of the most exuberantly gifted novelists of our generation. High praise. Great Circle ranges from Prohibition-era Montana to the wilds of Alaska, to wartime London, to modern Los Angeles, in an epic tale of 2 extraordinary women whose fates collide across geographies and centuries. What hooked me was that it's the story of a Hollywood actress, Hadley Baxter, and she is cast to play this famous aviatrix from the 1920s, 1930s named Marion Graves. So then there's the story of Hadley playing Marion for a film, but then also there's Marion's story, right? Hence why we're going back in time, right? From Prohibition-era Montana to wartime London.
Yes, she's created this character, Marion Graves. She was inspired by a statue that she saw in New Zealand of Jean Batten, who was the first person to fly solo from London to New Zealand. Her epic flights made history, but her name is now largely forgotten. So she's inspired by these early female aviation pioneers. And she created this character of Marion Graves, who's an orphan. She's a twin. So she grows up with her brother and they're looked after by their uncle, who's a painter. And she's just obsessed with flight. And as you get to know her, you understand the many reasons why that might be so. Meanwhile, that story is juxtaposed with this current day story of this movie actress. I'm thinking of Jennifer Lawrence in The Hunger Games or something. You know, she's been in this series called Archangel, and it's a franchise, and so she's done film after film, and she's hugely successful and famous and wealthy, and then she has this big meltdown moment, this falling from grace, and then the chance to redeem herself, I suppose, comes in the opportunity to get involved with making this biopic about Marion Graves. And it turns out that there are lots of parallels between their lives, and so there's lots of reasons why she's particularly drawn to this character. I'm about halfway through. It's one of those books. It is long, but once you're invested in these characters, you're sort of happy that it's long because you have this really nice sense of like, oh, great, you know, there's so much to go. You know, when you're really enjoying something, you don't want it to end. So I've been reading it on the Kindle and I've just been quite pleased at like how slowly the little percentage points are ticking up in the bottom. You're told really early on what happens to Marion Graves, so I know where she's going to end up, but I don't know how she's going to get there. That's really fascinating. And I like the fact that it has these really great, strong female characters. But also it has good male characters who are also really well drawn and are equally interesting. I'm curious to know how their stories are going to pan out as well. It's a really, really good one. I was surprised, just because it's so immersive and readable, to see it on the Booker long list. I thought,
right.
You know,
Is it? Interesting.
Maybe they're taking a bit more seriously the thing they always say about trying to choose books that are really readable.
My cover is blemished with a kind of printed stamp that says "Read with Jenna." Do you know who Jenna is?
Nope.
No.
Is she someone I should be reading with?
I feel like we should know who Read with Jenna is.
Is she Canadian?
Hashtag, I don't know. I suspect not. I suspect she's American. Hashtag Read with Jenna. And I'm like, why would I want to read with Jenna? Why is she on my beautiful jacket?
Today.com, Read with Jenna. Jenna Bush Hager?
Who's Jenna Bush Hager? Who knows?
I don't know.
We will know soon, and listeners, you might be shaking your heads at us. But regardless of whether or not Jenna wants to read it, I want to read it.
Hey, you know what, though? Scrolling through her pics, she's got good taste in books. There are loads of these. Look, Writers and Lovers, Lily King is there. Nothing to See Here, Kevin Wilson, which I love. The Dutch House, Anne Patchett.
Anyways, enough on Jenna. Great circle. I'm so excited to read it. I think I'm going to hold on to it, like, right for my first day of my holiday.
Because as you're saying, either you want short things that you can just fly through and then, you know, move on to the next one and you have a really pleasing sense of progress, or you want something really long, really immersive that's just going to carry you through the whole holiday.
Yeah, I know this episode has been quite wide-ranging, but I hope, listeners, that you have heard a couple books in this mix that you're like, oh yes, that is what I need for my summer reading.
And we also shouldn't forget those serendipitous books that you find in your hotel or your B&B or wherever you end up staying, or that charming little secondhand bookshop that you stumble on. You know, you have to leave room for those serendipitous holiday reads as well.
It's true. I abandon all loyalty in the face of an old bookshelf with other people's past holiday reads.
Well, listeners, we hope whatever you're doing, wherever you are, summer 2021 is a good one. Stay safe. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.
That's nearly it for this episode.
Those book recommendations were Sorrow Bliss by Meg Mason, Hotel Silence by Oda Ava Olafsdottir, Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri, D, A Tale of Two Worlds by Michael Faber, Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden-Keefe, The Book of Hidden Things by Francesco Dimitri, The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dalila Harris, Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, and Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead.
You can also find full details, plus a few extras on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk. And if you're so inclined, you can sign up to our bi-weekly newsletter there. It is reviews and recommendations and is full of reading inspiration to tide you over until our next episode.
If you want to follow us between episodes, find us on Instagram at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter and Facebook at Book Club RVW Pod, or email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. Do drop us a line and tell us what you're reading. We always love to hear from you.
And if you want to support the show, you can do so by subscribing and giving us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It always helps other listeners find us.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.